Gunpowder was discovered in China more than 1,000 years ago. But here's the strange part. The first true guns didn't immediately follow. It took centuries for humans to go from, "we have a powder that explodes," to, "we can put this inside a tube, launch a projectile, and somehow not blow ourselves up." Which sounds obvious now. It absolutely wasn't. So why did something as seemingly simple as the gun take centuries to develop? The answer begins with the fact that gunpowder wasn't originally created to make weapons at all. Chinese alchemists were searching for something almost completely opposite: immortality. During the Tang Dynasty, Taoist alchemists experimented with substances including sulfur, charcoal, and saltpeter, hoping to discover medicines or perhaps even an elixir that could extend life. Instead, they discovered a mixture remarkably good at setting things on fire. One early Taoist text describes a mixture containing these ingredients erupting into flame, burning the experimenters, and even setting their building on fire. Not quite immortality, but historically, arguably more influential.
The Chinese eventually realized that gunpowder could do much more than produce accidental fires. It became associated with firecrackers and fireworks, but it also began appearing in warfare. And this is where the path toward the gun really begins. By around the 10th and 11th centuries, Chinese armies were experimenting with gunpowder incendiaries, bombs, and other weapons. Then came one particularly important invention: the fire lance. Imagine a spear with a tube attached near its end. Gunpowder inside the tube was ignited, producing a violent burst of flame toward an enemy. Early versions were essentially close-range flame weapons, but over time, something important happened. The expanding gases from burning gunpowder didn't just create fire, they could throw objects forward. Now you have almost every basic ingredient of a firearm: gunpowder, a tube, and a projectile. Almost. Because understanding the idea was one thing, building a weapon that could survive its own explosion was another problem entirely.
This is the part that makes the history of the gun much more interesting. Gunpowder alone wasn't enough. A practical firearm required several technologies to work together. You needed a barrel strong enough to contain rapidly expanding gases. You needed gunpowder with a useful and reasonably consistent composition. You needed a projectile that fit the barrel. You needed a reliable way to ignite the powder. And eventually, if soldiers were going to carry these things around, the weapon had to be reasonably portable. That combination was difficult. Early gunpowder weapons could use bamboo or other relatively weak tubes, but once you want to launch a projectile with serious force, pressure becomes your enemy. Contain too little pressure, and your projectile doesn't go very far. Contain too much pressure in a badly made barrel, and the barrel itself can fail. Metal offered the solution, but producing reliable gun barrels was still a major manufacturing challenge. Bronze became an important material for early guns and cannon, while wrought iron was also used in increasingly sophisticated designs. Neither represented some magical overnight breakthrough. Casting, forging, barrel thickness, powder strength, projectile size, all of it had to work together. The gun wasn't one invention, it was a collection of technologies slowly becoming good enough at the same time.
By the 13th century, that technological puzzle was finally coming together. The exact moment when the first true gun appeared is debated, because technological evolution rarely gives historians a convenient birthday. But we have strong evidence from China. A sculpture from the 12th century appears to depict an early firearm-like weapon. Archaeological finds become even clearer later. One famous example is the Heilongjiang hand cannon dated to 1288. Now we're looking at something unmistakably gun-like: a metal barrel, gunpowder, a projectile. It was primitive. It didn't have a modern trigger. It wasn't particularly accurate, and compared with later firearms, it was almost comically crude. But the fundamental principle had arrived. The important thing is that this wasn't 600 years after gunpowder. Depending on where you draw the line between early gunpowder mixtures and a true firearm, the transition took a few centuries, still an incredibly long time for something that seems so obvious in hindsight. And then, the technology began traveling.
During the 13th century, Eurasia became connected in a particularly violent way. The Mongol conquests created an enormous empire, stretching across much of Asia and reaching into Europe. Gunpowder weapons were already being used in China, and warfare, migration, trade, and communication across this interconnected world helped gunpowder knowledge spread westward. The Mongols were probably part of that process, but they weren't necessarily the single reason gunpowder reached the West. Technology rarely travels through one neat historical pipeline. By the 13th century, knowledge of gunpowder appears in both the Islamic world and Europe, and by the early 14th century, European sources clearly describe canon. Then, development starts accelerating. Not because Europeans suddenly discovered some secret everyone else had missed. China and the Islamic world continued developing gunpowder weapons too, but Europe had its own powerful incentive. It was politically fragmented, heavily fortified, and frequently at war. Kings, cities, and rival states had very good reasons to invest in anything capable of breaking walls or defeating the army next door. Gunpowder had entered an arms race.
But there's another reason firearms didn't immediately replace bows, swords, and pikes. Early guns weren't necessarily better. Think about what an early gunner actually had to deal with. The weapon had to be manually loaded. Gunpowder had to be measured. The projectile had to be inserted. The powder then had to be ignited through a touch hole. Rain and moisture could cause problems. Accuracy was limited. Rate of fire was painfully slow. And early weapons lacked the sophisticated firing mechanisms that later firearms would use. Meanwhile, a highly trained archer could fire repeatedly, and experienced soldiers already understood bows, crossbows, swords, and polearms. So merely inventing the gun wasn't enough. The gun had to become useful enough to justify replacing technologies that had been refined for centuries. That required better barrels, better gunpowder, better ammunition, better ignition systems, and eventually, better tactics. As those improvements accumulated, firearms became increasingly powerful, reliable, and easier to use. And once that happened, warfare began changing permanently. And that's what makes the invention of the gun so interesting. There probably wasn't one moment when someone simply invented the gun. There was no single genius who woke up, combined gunpowder with a metal tube, and transformed warfare overnight. Instead, there were centuries of smaller discoveries, Chinese alchemists experimenting with chemicals, weapon makers turning fire into propulsion, craftsmen learning to build barrels capable of containing pressure, different cultures adapting and improving the technology, armies discovering what worked and what catastrophically didn't. The explosive wasn't the hardest part. The idea wasn't even the hardest part. The hard part was getting chemistry, metallurgy, manufacturing, ammunition, ignition, and military tactics to work together. And that's something we tend to forget about invention. Once a technology exists, it looks obvious. Before it exists, someone has to solve every invisible problem standing between the idea and something that actually works. Gunpowder gave humanity the explosion. It took centuries to learn how to aim it.